Much, Ricardo. First of all, can you all hear me properly?
Yes, yes.
Yes, it's going well. Good, good. Yeah, I was very, very happy to be here, and I'm always very happy when I'm talking to fellow researchers, and especially this time that is researchers that have the task of talking to students, talking
At
to
second
students.
at
Yeah,
secondary schools.
secondary
Secondary schools.
schools. Is it going to be high school as well, or only secondary?
Secondary and high schools, yes.
And high school. And if I understand correct, and do correct me if I'm wrong, this is going to be online presentation, right? So you will only have 10 minutes in
Yes,
an
that's right.
online format to speak to the
That's right.
students. Okay, so this is not an easy task. Uh, but it's brilliant at the same time. So I will start. Let me just make sure, first of all, I can share my screen. Um, and do let me know if yes. First of all, let me know you can see the screen, right? Oh, good, brilliant. Okay, thank you.
Yes, yes.
Excellent. So thanks, Ricardo, for the introduction. I think the only thing you should know about me is by training, I'm a molecular biologist, and I teach students at the university. I mostly teach anatomy and physiology, and also we do research. And I want to start the same way Theo started before. I'll tell you what I work on. Yeah. So let's say that what I do at the lab is I study the effects of exogenous microRNAs and specifically BTA MIR154C on human enterocytes and their interaction with the microbiome. So this is what I do. And if you didn't understand a thing, you shouldn't have understood a thing. So
We need a translation.
of course. So this is though the way we speak when we go to conferences. Yes. So we use terminology and we even assume that people would know what we're talking about. So in this setting, I guess it would make more sense if I could say that what I work on, what we work with my team in the lab is we try to see how much truth there is in the phrase, we are what we eat, and we also try to understand, does DNA from the food that we eat make bacteria that live in our intestines sad or happy? So hopefully now you understood a little bit more of what I do. I study the gut, I study food, and I study bacteria. And this is just an example to show you the mistakes that sometimes we make as scientists, researchers make, because we are so accustomed to talking to our peers, and sometimes we use terminology that we don't even understand that it's terminology. But we will delve more deep into this a little bit later on. So I want to start by this. So I think at this point in our workshop, we kind of delve deep into the why it's important to communicate science. And I hope both Theo and Dario, that show you the awe in science speaking, made a point about this. It's very, very important to communicate science. So not just to our peers, but to the society. And the best thing about society would be students, yes, that age group. So this is the why of science communication, understanding its vital importance, why it's important to bridge this gap. But now, in the next half an hour or so, I want us to delve deep into how we do that. Yeah. So I want to give you some practical advice, and I'm going to try and do it in a very structured way. I'll show you in a bit. So to tailor to your presentation, yeah, to presentation, a 10-minute presentation, therefore a short presentation in this setting, the online setting, which is not the best setting in the world. It's very good because it allows us to reach a great number of people, and this is brilliant. And in our case with MedNight, I mean, you can travel to the entire of the Mediterranean, just by getting into the screen in people's houses. But unfortunately, we lose these, the essence of having someone in front of you talking to you. Okay, now, we're going to do this for one of the most spirited audiences and difficult audiences out there, and that's elementary school students, right, Ricardo? Okay. So I'm going to start with this quote. This is attributed to Albert Einstein, but guys, I'm not sure if it's in fact Einstein's quote. We keep guessing on the internet, Albert Einstein and all these different quotes, but it does capture the very essence of the goal, my goal today. And that's that if you can't explain something to a 6-year-old, then you probably don't really understand it yourself. But there's an asterisk. Remember that explaining something in single terms, it's actually more difficult than it is to use your everyday terminology, scientific terminology. So it isn't an easy task, and we'll talk more about this in a bit. So as researchers, as scientists, the understanding of our work should be so profound that we should theoretically be able to break it down into its simplest, most understandable forms. So it's all about the importance of this simplicity and clarity when we communicate with particular audiences. Now, communicating science, let's try to kind of divide it into two things. One is what we call scientific communication. Yeah, scientific communication is what happens in conferences, what happens at research workshops, when you try to write a research paper. That's where you communicate knowledge to scientists and technical experts following the scientific method. And we have to say that we are trained as researchers to do it. From year one, when I teach my students at year one, to pay a lot of attention to the background, to the methodology, because someone else needs to grab that and repeat it. Yeah, because science is all about replication. Now, we call it scientific communication. Now, on the other hand, you have science communication. Yeah, that's communicating with a broad range of audiences. It could be the general public. It could be, we shouldn't say general, it could be the public. It could be policymakers. It could be journalists. It could be kids, students, like in our case. So doing science by itself, it's overwhelming. It takes a lot of our time. Being in a lab for us biologists, it does take a lot of our time. So sometimes we forget about science communication. And we don't really train our students to communicate science to the public. We don't do that usually. So even though more and more universities and research institutions, they do try to incorporate into their curriculum a little bit of science outreach. So let me show you a picture. So here's one of my students presenting a poster. And I'm going to urge you to try and get out of this concept, the concept of talking science into science conferences. We're going to try to forget how it is now to write science for a scientific journal. And let's try to move more into something that looks like this. Yeah. These are our students that tried, now to have a connection with the public. So these are our students in science festivals. This is actually from a few years ago during the Researchers' Night. So now you already understand the difference. It's not about bombarding these young minds with data, with graphs, and with equations, but now it's about igniting a spark in their eyes, if you can, to create this moment of awe, exactly like Dario said in the previous presentation. So, and as scientists, as researchers, we do hold the power to make people feel this magic of science. So it's this enthusiasm that we try to pass on. And I'm going to show you a few more pictures. So this is again my students from the human biology program. So from time to time, we make the effort of trying to get the students out there to talk to children, to talk to elementary students, to talk to families, old ages, about what they learn in the lab, what they learn at the university. And by having this experience, we think that and give them usually a bit of a workshop in between, before that, to try to give them the opportunity to be trained not only in scientific communication, but also in science communication as well, to the layman audience. So here again, you see how we were studying back then, for example, gut physiology, and we took a stomach and an intestine for animals, and we tried to show students, we tried to get students to fill the stomach with stuff, so that they can get all excited and then explain the anatomy and physiology at the same time. And this is now from last year. These are again the human biology students. This time we were doing at the time a respiratory track, so that's how do we breathe, and we decided to take a lung. So what you see there is a lung hanging, and we're blowing up the lung, hopefully to inspire that awe to the families and the children. And maybe some of them would be intrigued and wanting to learn a little bit more about, the breathing process in humans. A final picture. We take students to festivals. So the picture you see there on the left is from the big Pride Festival that took place in Nicosia a few years ago. Because we believe that sometimes science can also help with issues, like how the way nature loves variety, and how there's all this variety concerning sexuality, nature, and all of that. If you showcase that in a really nice way, maybe you can put a little bit of, you can help a little bit with acceptance. Now, okay. How do we make science accessible to the non-specialized audience? How do we talk about scientific topics in a simple way, and especially to this very interesting but also tough population, such as students, elementary students? And before I try to give you some very specific tips, I think it's important to mention something that has already been mentioned today, but I think it's important to say that communicating science is so crucial that it has actually become a field of study in its own. Okay, so today we have the science of science communication because of its growing importance, and I think Theo talked to you about how important it was, and Dario, during the pandemic, during all about climate change. So scientists now gather lots of data from research, okay, on how to do it effectively. And obviously you have different audience, different stakeholders, and each one of them requires a certain way to talk to them about scientific issues. So this is welcome to the world of the science of science communication. Now, universities and institutions are now nowadays offering even dedicated programs, to hone these skills. So both in the UK and Holland and places like that, there are master programs on how to communicate science, so dedicated programs. And I think I'm telling you this because I think it's very, very important to understand that the way we communicate science is complicated, and it should be evidence-based. But at the same time, and I'm showing you here that there are specific journals now dedicated to the science of science communication. Okay, and there was even a front cover on PNAS called The Science of Science Communication. Now, okay, this doesn't mean that at the same time, we cannot break this down into some practical tips for you. So what I'm going to try to do now today is I'm going to share with you, and I organized this as a countdown because the online setting is difficult enough. So hopefully you won't get too bored if we do it this way. So the plan is I'm going to give you my favorite 10 tips, practical tips, hands-on tips, when you communicate science in an online format for a very specific amount of time, 10 minutes, to this particular audience, which are students. Okay, so chat about science with people that are not in lab coats, yeah, and hopefully they will come in handy to you as well. Feel free, if you have any questions, to just write them in the chat, or even to just unmute your microphone and go ahead and interrupt. Okay, so tip number 10, position number 10. Who are you talking to? Yeah, so adapt to your audience. The first thing that's important when you're giving when you're into a science communication, a science outreach event, is to spend a little bit of time to try and know your audience. It sounds easier than it actually is, because it's important, I think, to tell you that no audience is homogeneous. Yeah, even when we say this is going to be elementary school students, that's a heterogeneous audience as well. But still, it's important to research and try to understand your audience, yeah? And then organize and deliver your presentation based on what you think are your audience's expectations, the backgrounds, the circumstances. Different audience has different needs. So who are they? You're going to talk differently to a journalist or to a policymaker, or to our audience, secondary school students. And here, maybe it's important to say, has something happened recently, in the world that probably they know about it? Use that in your presentation. Theo earlier on talked about the floods, these horrible floods that are happening now in Greece. You can use things that are in the news, okay, to grab your audience attention, to make it tailored, specific to your audience. And there is a general rule, I don't know if this helps, that comes from AAAS on the styles of communication. In general, when we talk to our peers, other teachers or scientists, or we tend to describe a ton of details and background information before we actually give the result in the end. This is the nature of how graduate students are trained to write their theses, to write their dissertations. It's how scientists deliver their presentations at conferences and when they write a poster, okay? But for students, in our case, and for children, this approach needs to be flipped. So this triangle needs to be the other way around. First, you start, with the bottom line, your key message. Then it's very important to really, really focus on the so what. Okay, why should we care? Why is this relevant to you? Okay, so this is the main thing, rather than the background, the methodology that you use, or those details that we have been trained to do. So this is all about the so what, okay? And this brings me to tip number 9. Make your audience care, okay? And I'm really happy because the previous speakers, both Theo and Dario, talked about this. Today we do know from research, from data, that people need to trust in order to listen to you, okay? Data are important. Obviously, we have to base what we say on data, but a graph is not going to make your audience care. I think the important thing is to find a connection, something beyond facts and figures, beyond data and graphs. You have to find a way to create an emotional bond between you, the researcher, and the students. So you need to find a way to make this science-related information that you plan to communicate with your students, you have to make it engaging and you have to make it relevant. So the other person needs to feel like you are talking to them, okay? And you need to see probably these eyes as the picture in your left there. People are actually at awe, if you can say that. So how do you make people care? Well, it's what we mentioned, and I'm glad we mentioned it because I'm glad we're repeating this particular tip because it's probably one of the most important ones: scientific storytelling. So try to tell people stories. Dario mentioned it, described it, and analyzed it in a very, very good way. Stories are facts wrapped in emotions, as Olson said in 2009. So science communicators keep looking for ways to help people make sense of science, okay, and care about science-related issues. It could be, climate change. It could be health issues. When they use and they try to use storytelling as a tool, okay. We have so many data now that storytelling is one of the most powerful tools. And stories typically have a beginning, they have a middle, they have an end. We call that the narrative arc. And sometimes there are some unexpected twists and turns in that story, which makes the story even more interesting. Sometimes stories build tension, they keep the attention of the readers, the listeners. And this is something you really want to take under advantage. I'm going to repeat what Daria said, that all animals and many plants, I guess, trees, if you ask a plant biology, they have ways of communicating with each other. Yeah. All plants and animals do it, but only humans tell stories. So storytelling is arguably one of our defining characteristics. It sets us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. Yeah, we evolved sitting around a campfire, telling stories to each other, and I think Dario mentioned that we even have dedicated cognitive mechanisms and parts of our brain for listening and remembering stories. Okay, so let's use these parts of human anatomy and physiology to be effective in our communication. So we are wired to listen to stories. Now, when you decide to say a story, to use a story as a tool, it's important to try to relate it also to their world. Let's say you are a biologist and you study bacteria, like we do in the lab. Related to the yogurt, maybe. So say, when you eat yogurt, you take in bacteria. Or, for example, if you study artificial intelligence, AI, try to connect it to things like the video games that the kids play, or I don't know, Siri, the voice assistants that we have, things that kids probably know about. So that direct relevance to something they know is like a bridge between your research, what you're going to tell them, and their interests and things that they already know. Okay. Another thing which is important in storytelling is, which also helps with them forming a connection to you, is say a personal story. Yeah. How did you get into this research in the first time? I don't know, tell them about all your experiments that went wrong and how nothing worked until one day it did. Or who inspired you to study research in the first place. Tell them what Dolores told you, Theo, about, I went to a party and someone asked me what I do, and I said something and realized no one talked to me at that party ever again. Use these personal stories because they are powerful tools. And maybe an extra tip: if you think you have it as well, use humor, make them laugh. We cannot all do that, but if you can, if it comes in handy to you, go for it. And now let's go to tip number 8. No, for number 8, I'm going to tell you, when you start your presentation, especially your online presentation, start with a hook. And what does that mean? it means that, I don't know, do you remember the last time that you watched maybe a movie or you read a book and it grabbed your attention right from the start, from the first scene? This is your goal. Okay, so for example, I don't know, if you're presenting on marine biology, you can start with something that's exciting. Did you know that octopuses have 3 hearts? Yeah, so that's an instant intrigue for the students. You start with something like that, and then you continue. Let me, because if you remember tip 1, yeah, you need to bond with your audience, and grabbing their attention immediately from the beginning. This is something that could help with this bond. Okay, so for example, you can start with an astonishing fact. Let me show you. You can, if you're discussing space, use a fact. Do you know that there are more stars in the universe than grains of sand on all beaches of Earth? So this is something that could get the attention of some of the students. Or, I don't know, if you want to talk physics, you can tell them, you can use an interactive question. Have you ever wondered why the sky is blue, but why are sunsets red or pink or even purple? You start with a question and then you delve deep into the science. You can also, especially for this particular age group, you can use relevant pop culture. So my son, for example, keeps watching Jurassic Park. So if you study genetics, why don't tell them, how is studying genetics similar to the Jurassic Park? Dinosaurs are always a blockbuster, as we say, with this particular age, especially elementary school. Okay. You can use other things as well. You can challenge them with predictions. I mean, you can tell them, by the time you graduate from school or from college, we might have robots doing, making us lunch or something like that, and then delve into the science behind it. Okay. Especially because you will presenting online, you can use that to your benefit. You can show some really nice images and videos, and I'll get back to that later on. You can show like a video of a supernovae or something really, really exciting, and then continue to your story. So this initial hook, as we say, can have a very significant impact to how the rest of your presentation is perceived by the students. So my advice would be to really invest some time to that initial sentence at the beginning. Okay, let's now go to tip number 7. So for number 7, I would say use the power of analogies and metaphors. And one of the most strong tools in a science communicator's kit is the use of these analogies and metaphors. Think of them as a bridge that links the familiar to the unfamiliar. So I have some examples here. Well, most of them from biology, which is my field, but we talk about the cell, the cell nucleus. You want to say something which is a bit complicated about the nucleus. Use it as the power plant, the factory, the power plant of the cell. Or you want to talk about DNA. You can make an analogy with the book of life, where the book is your genome, the entire DNA, and each page of the book can be a chromosome, and then each paragraph, for example, can be the gene, and then, I don't know, stuff in between that are not very interesting, or the lines in between could be, the parts of the DNA that don't code for a gene or something like that. But use those analogies. And I'll use another example that was very popular, we can say, in recent times. Unfortunately, we heard a lot about mRNA vaccines. The word mRNA was heard for the first time for most people, and I don't think there is now a person in the world that haven't heard of the word mRNA, which stands for messenger RNA. Now, for example, here I'll give you a metaphor. mRNA vaccines, are like, if in the traditional vaccines you gave your body a piece of cake to eat, yeah, so that it knows that cake, it creates memory of that cake. Then with mRNA vaccines, is like you give your body the recipe to make the cake. So you don't give it the actual chocolate cake, but you give it the recipe to make the cake. And I think this was a very powerful metaphor that was out there for people to understand. Another really excellent metaphor, which I always enjoy, is the concept of weather and climate. Yeah, so you're a climate scientist. You can compare weather to your daily mood. So weather is your daily mood, climate is your personality. Therefore, if you don't like the weather, wait for a few hours, it might change. But if you don't like the climate, maybe it's time to move. And in our case, maybe it's time to move planets overall. So you anchor this complex term to something that people can relate, and you make this intricate idea even more accessible and memorable to your audience. I'll show you an example from my work, something I use in my presentation. So this is something I work in the lab, which probably makes zero sense here. So this is, guys, what happens inside a cell, a human cell, when the cell is stressed. So if a cell is stressed because it has mutations or you've stressed it in various ways, which could be heat or cold or whatever, then you have a cell that keeps doing all these things at once. And it needs to decide, and all these things at once tell the cell if it's going to continue living and fix the issue, or if it's going to go and commit suicide. Suicide in biology, we call it apoptosis, but it's pretty much committing suicide, yeah? So we call this a molecular pathway. We call this the unfolded protein response pathway. It seems pretty chaotic, but when I want to explain the fact that, in fact, there is order in this chaos that you see here, and you can really break it down into easier steps that actually make sense, then I like to compare it with this. And what you see here is the Tokyo subway map. So that's how people use the subway to move from one place to the other in Tokyo. Yeah. So just like in the Tokyo subway map, it looks like a total mess, but there is logic in it and it works. And if you spend some time using it, then probably you can also, make the right decisions, and it helps people go from one place to the other. So this is the same with the cellular pathway that we study in the lab. So use metaphors where you can and use analogies where you can. I'm now going to move to tip number 6, okay? Don't be afraid to use pictures and don't be afraid to use visuals. Yeah. Our brains do process images and videos that are continuous images faster than text. And again, our brains are hardwired to see pictures and videos, just as we are with stories. We have the cliche saying that says, one picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, it actually is worth 1,000 words. And I'll give you another example. You can, for example, talk to students about, how climate change is affecting the coral reefs and how coral reefs are destroyed because of that. And we lose biodiversity and we lose all those animals and plants. But why not give them a video? For example, I found this, hopefully this is going to play. Why don't you show them this? Like a beautiful coral reef that slowly fades into a dead coral reef. So this visual it gives people something to see and feel and connect with your message way more than if you actually just described it to them. And again, an online setting gives you the power to do that in a very easy way. Okay, or these are a few other pictures. This was a very, very powerful picture, The Sewage Surfer by Justin Hoffman. This was one of the pictures that was a finalist in a photojournalist awards because, Nothing says wildlife more than a seahorse swimming in the ocean holding a cotton pad. Or the other pictures from a student of ours in one of the in the researchers' night, where, you know, when you talk about evolution, look at these two babies, a Homo sapiens baby and a chimpanzee baby, both having the same expression when they come in contact with a cold stethoscope. So these are powerful images, and my tip would be spend some time to find powerful images for your presentation, because they really, really tell a story, and they really make people, you know, to pause and think. Now, we're halfway through. Tip number 5. This is the so-called KISS principle of science communication. KISS stands for keep it short and simple, or it stands for keep it simple, stupid. And it really is a golden rule for efficiency, especially if you're giving a talk that is 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So many times we think that it's better to use a lot of words and text to help explain something better, but that's not always the case. In fact, it can make things even more confusing. Okay, if you have a PowerPoint presentation which is filled with information, okay, it's tempting to put all the information so that you don't miss out anything. But in a way, that PowerPoint is like background noise to your actual act, which is your speech. Okay, so when you have slides, those slides should just support what you're saying. Okay, they shouldn't steal the show, if that makes sense. So remember to have like big, nice pictures, a clear font, not a lot of animations, not clapping, not things coming in and out, because our attention and our brain can pick up a specific cognitive load, not more than that. So you don't want, again, your PowerPoint to steal the show. And also, in the case of a 10-minute presentation, you don't want a lot of points out there. You don't want to tell them this and that and the other one and point number 10. No, you need to focus on one or two important take-home messages. I think this was heard before in this workshop. You're only going to remember very few things. People will remember very few things. So decide which things they are. And then there is this interesting saying that says, tell them what you're going to tell them, then say it to them, and then tell them what you told them. Yeah. So use this repetition, keep it in a few points, keep it short and simple. And I think this is a powerful, then you're going to have a powerful and rememberable presentation, a presentation people remember. Okay. So tip number 4. The so-called jargon. When we say jargon, we mean scientific methodology. When you talk, the words matter. So jargon, I see it as a wall, as a barrier between what you want to say and your audience, in this case, the students. And it's interesting because you know who uses jargon on purpose without explaining? It's usually pseudoscientists or charlatans, following the saying of, you know, if you can't explain it, or if you can't if you cannot convince people, then confuse people by using all these science and scientific sounding words. In our case, if you really should use a technical term, then make sure you break it down, you explain it, you use a metaphor for it, and I'll tell you an example. So this is, for example, a picture from when I was doing my PhD ages ago. I spent a couple of years creating this model. So this is a protein model. It's how a protein works, how it moves into space. And I was explaining this to my parents, and I was saying, oh, and I was able to publish this amazing model and my model. And then halfway through, I realized that my mom actually thought I was talking about fashion models, or the models she knew about. The word model didn't make any sense in biology to her. Okay, so even a word that we all know could mean something else to you as a researcher, and it could mean someone else to the student or the general public. Yeah. So I'll just gather some here to show you. So you can say chemical, and for you as a chemist or a biologist, it could mean any chemical, any molecule out there. But for the public, this could mean a toxic substance or a poison, and I don't want any chemicals in my food. So it's better to use, any molecule rather than the word chemical. Or if you use the word genetic modification, then people truly might think of, Frankenstein food and monsters and changing your DNA in a bad way. Whereas it's better to use a different term, something that doesn't scare people. Even the word hypothesis, that's why I put it here. The word hypothesis is a very interesting one because in science, hypothesis means something very, very specific. It's an educated guess, yeah? So it's the best explanation that we have for something based on the data. But when you use hypothesis out there, it's like, I have a hypothesis and maybe I have another hypothesis, and it's just something that we think, but we don't really know about it. Yeah, so it can cause confusion. So be very careful of your words. And I'm just going to show you this very briefly. For example, there's a website out there. It's called Lol My Thesis, where people put their thesis titles. I'll show you some examples, what they do, and then they also try to write it in a simple word without using the jargon. Yeah, I'll just read one. So, for example, there's one. The actual thesis is foundation species loss emphasizes effect of grazers in ant community diversity, a study in 2 forest systems. You can say that without using the jargon. In when a tree falls in the forest, do ants care? Well, depends on the forest. Okay, so this is a website that you can visit, and I mean, you also have fun reading the different theses and how people communicate them to the public, but at the same time, it's a very useful exercise in order to see how it is not to use jargon. Okay, now we need at this point to, I think it's more honest to say that, guys, we have to acknowledge that science is not, a walk in the park. Science is actually complex, and it has intricate details, and it has specialized fields, and it can be a really real challenge to share our findings and our research with people that don't live and breathe on the same topics. Okay, so we do try to take that complexity away and make it accessible and engaging. But at the same time, we do have to acknowledge that it's not a simple task. And I really feel that I need to stress this because, this is where the real challenge in science communication rests. We have to agree that it is hard. It is hard to explain sometimes. And when we try to do a science communication, when you try to understand and talk about it, it's just an effort we make. And here I want to show you, for me, the most important, perhaps, rule in science communication. And that rule is that when you talk science, when you write science with a non-specialized audience, the goal is not to be 100% correct in what you're saying or in what you're writing, but the goal is not to be wrong. Okay? So back to the example that I used about my science, when I say, well, what I'm actually studying is how much truth is there in the phrase, we are what we eat. It's indeed what we're doing in the lab, but it's not specifically what we're doing in the lab. So it's okay to know that you might not be able to tell them exactly what you're doing. Just try not to be wrong. Because do you know who is wrong? Again, pseudoscience, because it doesn't care about accuracy. It can use all these catchy phrases without worrying about, is this correct or wrong? But when you actually communicate science, you have to be aware of that. Okay, so let's move to tip number 3, slowly getting to the end, and I'll go through this quickly. We are in the digital age. You need to use this to your advantage. So use things like, especially if since it's an online talk, you can use a quick poll or a quiz during your talk. You can use Kahoot. There are always different websites that are freely available and allow you to interact with the students. You can use digital visuals like 3D models. You want to talk about the heart, you can show a 3D model of a rotating heart. There are interactive simulations out there that you can use. And things like, I always find it interesting, especially with the students. Students know all about YouTube. They know all about TikTok. Yeah, you can use that. Just make sure the video you use, especially on TikTok, it's an accurate one. Okay, so you do the filter, then embed that into your presentation if it makes sense. Okay. Other things like word clouds, like Mentimeter, there you can get people to write words, and these appear in your presentation, and it makes it again more interactive. Okay, so tip number 3: engage with interactive elements. So guys, my last 2 tips were, number 1, to conclude with a take-home message. So especially for a 10-minute presentation, it's very important to make your ending memorable. Yeah? And that ending, I claim it should be simple. Again, it should be relevant, the same things that we said before. And, it could be something that inspires action or curiosity to these young minds. So that was my tip number 1. Tip number 2. And tip number 1, of course, it's practice. So even if you're a very experienced speaker, it's always a good idea to practice your talk. Practice builds confidence. You find little details that you missed. You make sure you're on time. You make sure you don't read your slides, but you actually engage. Yeah. It's also a good idea to practice that talk with people that are not in the field, your family, your parents, anything that can help you understand the little jargon words here and there that you might have missed. And of course, to rehearse the technology, so that nothing goes wrong. Okay, very important. And I was going to say that these are my 10 tips, and I will share these slides so you can read them again if you want. But I want to leave you with one final one. And the final one is that it's very important to show your passion. So we all know that sometimes it's not the words that you use, the amount of information you have, but it's not what you say, but how you say it. So don't be afraid to show your passion about your work, about what you do, about this presentation that you created, because passion is contagious. And I'm going to leave you with the fact that you have an opportunity here to inspire these young minds. So be passionate about it. Even if you inspire 1 or 2, it's a huge gain. And I will finish this talk again with Carl Sagan, same as Dario did. Carl Sagan said that not explaining science seems to me perverse. It's like when you're in love and you want to tell the world about it. So go ahead and have an amazing presentation, and don't be afraid to show your passion about it. Okay, so thank you. I hope this time I managed.
Thank you very much, Myrtani.
Brilliant.
We maybe have time for 1 or 2 questions, quick questions. 5 seconds. No questions. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Thank you very much, Myrtani.
Thank you.